Conflict and Compromise, the Battle for Okinawa. The Battle for Okinawa was a conflict that took place in World War II. This was set from 1939 to 1945 and was between the Allied forces and the Axis powers. The Allied forces was made of France, Britain, and the Soviet Union along with other countries. The Axis powers was composed of Germany, Italy, and Japan. In December of 1941, America decided to enter what would be the most gory conflict in mankind's history. This sudden decision was formed because of Japan's unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack featured plane bombers that dropped torpedoes, decimating 20 naval ships and 8 enormous battleships. It also included the destruction of nearly 300 airplanes and the wreckage of Pearl Harbor Air Base. After the attack, the number of recorded deaths was just above 2,400, as well as nearly 1,000 injured soldiers or civilians. Although they tried to avoid intervening with the various countries involved in heinous attacks, America had no choice but to rise up after such an attack on our way of life. This began America's involvement in the conflict of World War II.
The Battle of Okinawa was a bloody conflict against the Japanese resistance that helped lead to victory in the Pacific for America and the Allied forces in World War II. 4 years later, in 1945, the Allied forces had successfully pushed Japan back and began planning an assault in which they would attack the Japanese forces on the island of Okinawa. Okinawa is an island in the East China Sea that lies just over 1,200 miles away from mainland Japan. It was one of many other Japanese guarded territories used as stepping stones by America to get to the enemy country. These strategic attacks were known as Operation Iceberg and were an effort to take over the islands surrounding Japan. This would allow airplane bombers to be able to fly safely to Japan without having to worry about being shot down or run out of fuel. During the course of their preparation, the Allies managed to bomb the shore of the island, land troops to clear the way, and successfully prepare a landing zone for the remaining bulk of the army. All of this took place in a matter of less than a week. Finally, on April 1st, 1945, the Allied forces officially began their attack on the island of Okinawa. Their ships and destroyers filled the outer rim of the ocean surrounding the island. After the landing zone was cleared, small transports, tightly packed with soldiers from the U.S. 10th Army, moved to the shore of the beach. This army was unique because it was the combined forces of the 7th, 27th, 77th, and 96th Infantry Divisions, as well as the 1st, 2nd, and 6th Divisions of the Marine Corps. With its variety of divisions of combat, the 10th Army consisted of close to 180,000 troops under the command of Lieutenant General Simon Buckner.
After arriving at the beaches, the soldiers ran into very little resistance from any Japanese combatants. From April 1st to 4th, the 10th Army swept through the northern portion of the island in search of the Japanese defenders. Although they had no luck finding their military soldiers, they did run into many non-combatants that were drafted and forced into defensive positions along the island. While searching North Okinawa, soldiers had taken many of these untrained civilians as prisoners and managed to capture 2 enemy airfields. In addition, they began to realize from prisoner interrogation that Japan's defenses had been set to heavily fortify the southern portion of the island. On April 6th, after marching for hours, the Allied forces spotted the enemy defenses, as they predicted, in the south. Beginning their attack, they noticed that the enemy had carved out many holes in the ground that they used for cover. These trenches were all intricately connected to one another underground and created a line that touched one edge of the island to the other. They were the front lines of the enemy defense and formed a barrier that nearly 130,000 Japanese soldiers had to protect against the incoming Allies. At the head of this defensive campaign was Lieutenant General Ushishima.
The following day, Japan began a series of kamikaze attacks that lasted until the end of the battle. Kamikazes were specifically trained pilots whose job was to do one thing: crash their vehicle along with the bomb attached into enemy battleships. None of the drivers were pilots because they were used for air combat. Instead, they were trained very briefly by professionals and were taught where to crash their plane. After the battle concluded, the amount of kamikaze planes launched was totaled to about 1,400 compared to the 20 sunken, as well as 160 damaged Allied naval ships. In an attempt to once again slow down the Allied forces, Japan sent a strike force consisting of 10 surface ships as well as a super battleship, that led the way. This mission was known as Operation Tango. Its battleship was, at the time, the largest naval craft in the world. However, this mission was considered suicide because the ships would not be receiving any planes to escort them. Although the enemy had hoped to reach the Allied fleet and slow their progress, they never even reached Okinawa from where they were deployed in Japan. Allied submarines in the near area had spotted the watercrafts and reported this information back to their base. From there, nearly 300 planes were launched towards the incoming fleet. The ships did not stand a chance and were destroyed in nearly 2 hours.
Meanwhile, the Allied forces planned to capture the island of Leishima for its close proximity to the main stronghold of Motobu Peninsula. It also contained one of the largest air bases in the region and could be used to provide air support in the battle. So, the Allies began their assault on April 16th with a naval bombardment on the beaches of Leishima, followed by the landing of the military troops. The intense conflict lasted for 6 whole days, in which the Allies had the soldiers completely surrounded. However, its lengthy time period was due to the enemy's strong defensive fortifications that consisted of about 7,000 Japanese soldiers. Like many of the showdowns in this battle, it took time to gain mere inches and resulted in many stalemates. After these 6 long days of ongoing rivalry, the island of Leishima was finally secured by the Allies on April 21st. There had been 4,706 Japanese killed, but at a cost of 172 American lives lost.
Shuri Castle was the largest and most fortified Japanese base and was surrounded by other defensive strongholds. On May 13th, the U.S. began another assault that included invading these strongholds. It also required the capture of Sugarloaf Hill, Conical Hill, Chocolate Drop Hill, and even the capital city, Naha. Within a week and a half of relentless fighting, the U.S. had captured the strongholds and forced the defenders into Shuri Castle. On May 29th, the U.S. finally gained control of the vital capture point. In a single week, Shuri Castle was completely demolished after being continuously fired at by the Navy, artillery, as well as bombed by Allied planes. Almost 2 weeks later, the generals of the 10th Army realized that the tide of the battle had turned to their advantage. In an effort to end the battle peacefully, the Allied powers made a peace treaty on June 10th that was sent to the Japanese officers. Nonetheless, they pressed their forces on after receiving no response from the enemy side. In less than a week, Lieutenant General Ushishima's exhausted army was forced into a small pocket of land southeast of the island Itomen. The next day, on June 10th, General Buckner of the Allies was monitoring his progress when he was shot down by enemy fire. However, it did not affect the battle at all due to the fact that Okinawa was practically seized and that Buckner was replaced promptly by Marine General Roy Geiger.
On June 21st, Ushijima and General Cho committed suicide by stabbing themselves in the stomach in their command headquarters on Hill 89 just before the battle ended. This was a Japanese tradition used for commanders that failed their duties. Although this date was the time that the fighting had stopped, many Japanese on the island had gone into hiding, and the surrender ceremony did not happen until a few months later. Following the battle at Okinawa, plans were made by the Allied powers to eliminate the threat of Japan. They decided to drop 2 atomic bombs. Although they knew it would kill thousands of innocent lives, they realized it would be the only way to preserve the lives of millions of other soldiers from both sides.
So, on August 6th, an American bomber was sent to the Japanese city of Hiroshima, where the first ever deployed atomic bomb was dropped. 3 days later, another bomb was dropped on a city called Nagasaki. The results of these bombs were devastating. Nearly 120,000 people combined in both cities perished after the massive nuclear weapons were dropped. Japan's Emperor Hirohito announced his country's complete surrender by way of radio to the Allied forces on August 15th. The official compromise of the Japanese took place a month later on September 2nd, when peace treaties were signed declaring their end in the war.
If it was not for the brave men who fought and prevailed in the conflict at Okinawa, the bombers may have never made it to Japan. Also, if the Allies had not taken control of the vital islands, the war may have concluded in Japan's favor. In addition, the Japanese may have never surrendered if the bombs were not dropped, leading to more unnecessary Allied casualties. The Battle of Okinawa was a crucial turning point in World War II that paved a path to Japanese surrender.